So I have a couple of questions for Jennifer to start with. So what can you tell us about Project 2025's plan for using mass surveillance and machine learning? And what are your thoughts about the data collected, processed, and shared by Palantir or Doge?
Yeah, I mean, I think Palantir did a really good job, PR job over the years in portraying itself as just data analysis and not really, making that just like we have this information and we just look at it and make sense of it, and that was kind of like a politically neutral sort of thing. I think now, like, the political neutrality of that, the veneer of that is clearly gone with the way that Peter Thiel is totally red-pilled and against politics and everything. And I think what it shows more broadly that people didn't necessarily understand, and maybe that's because analysis wasn't as powerful as it is now, is that it's not just about the availability of the data, but also about the way that we make sense of it and who we're making sense of it for. It's not a Project 2025 thing specifically, like the move to mass surveillance has been a long time coming, mostly driven by propaganda about the war on terror and the war on drugs. But obviously, that rhetoric then repurposed for all types of law enforcement, even things that are not necessarily, or don't think of as being crimes. And it's, the evolution really of technology in the civil space, like the rise of social media and email and all these technologies that persistently collect so much of our information. And then those things, which I really love, and everybody knows me at my job as like the person who's like really gives away her privacy for like a map or something like that. I really love those things, but that data collection has been cannibalized or colonized by law enforcement and repurposed for that, often in ways that people don't truly understand and in ways that are kind of contrary to our democratic principles, specifically that many of the types of surveillance we see don't have judicial oversight, which is just like base level kind of table stakes thing, but that's not what they're doing.
Okay, great. This kind of leads into our second two-part question that probably is on the minds of a lot of artists and creators here, which is how is machine learning now being deployed to collect data on artists, creative activists, and to repress freedom of expression in the public sphere? That's one part, and then really we are concerned about that. Our films being shown, our photographs being disseminated, paintings, because like you were saying, it's having to get lawyers, having to be harassed. Maybe your passport is being taken away. We don't know who it is. So that's part one. And then part two of that second question is how can creative citizens influence the design and deployment of algorithmic systems in public life, if that's at all possible.
I'll be interested in what you guys think about that as well. But I think in terms of what we're seeing, we're sort of in a lot of ways at the beginning. We know from looking at other oppressive regimes that artists are among the vanguard of people who get attacked or kind of discredited because art is such a powerful and important way to communicate to people. What we're seeing at the ACLU is a real attack right now on observers. So journalists, photographers, and then just people who are armed with cell phone cameras that are recording the activities of ICE out on the street. And so we've done, a lot of work over the years on the right to record, but to be honest, we haven't really seen that right under the same kind of pressure or attack that we see it now. And I think that we are definitely in a realm where things that people say on the internet are being taken and misrepresented as basically threatening ICE agents or interfering or obstructing justice or, those sorts of things. And that can be everything from, something that you post on social media to being in Portland and wearing a frog costume with like 20 other frog costume people, and that being like, I think, a kind of performance art, and that ending up being something that is treated as obstruction or masking your identity in a way that's suspicious or that sort of thing. The second question was about what can artists do about
What can creative citizens really do to influence algorithmic issues in public life?
Yeah, I mean, I think some part of that, depending upon what kind of creator you are, is to think about what data you collect when you make your thing. Like if you're making a video game or you're, creating some kind of interactive, project or something like that. It's always very tempting, I think, to collect as much information as possible because you think, oh, I can make it better or that sort of thing. And that very well may be true, but then you have to think about how do you protect that data if you're going to collect it. So I think that's kind of like a front-line thing. I always think that, a lot of great art has been done kind of as satire or just sort of, turning the mirror back and letting people see what is happening. And I normally have some examples of this in my mind, but I'm forgetting. But I think there are a lot of kind of, interactive exhibits or, things that people have built that are parodies or sort of you can see under the hood of what it is, and it mirrors what we see in our everyday life. And, to the extent that that educates or sensitizes people, I think that's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Nora, I'm going to try to link a couple of reflections and questions that were posed to you. One person had commented that, I think maybe as a critique of something you had said, that AI systems aren't really bypassing reality any more than a human does. In both cases, the idea and output are the result of experiencing real references, but which are interpreted through generative or imaginative systems to create something that has not been created before.
Yep.
Similarly, a question was posed that sort of relates to that, which asks, I think, really about how do we assess value. The question is specifically, how do you propose that we get access to the taxonomies, processes, and models? What is the right level of transparency that we should demand and expect from AI creators, and how to enforce it? And why can't we just accept AI at face value? Sorry, AI's creation at face value.
Those are great questions. Thanks for whoever asked them. For that first question about bypassing reality, I think that was maybe a way to rephrase that within like the context of the argument is when we see images now and increasingly we're unable to tell whether something is synthetic, like that ability to have that asymptote is like collapsing and becoming smaller and smaller. So when we bring our like perceptual and critical apparatus to a synthetic image, read it as an image that has a one-to-one connection in reality, meaning like by a human hand or through human intention, there's a mismatch or a disconnect. And so to move into this kind of field of where AI and humans are going to be collaborating more and more, or we are already collaborating often with AI, is to accept a kind of like non-human intelligence, that we are one within a large range of intelligences. And so there are many kinds of realities. There's animal realities and bacterial realities and autonomous realities. And then there's also the belief that we bestow on automated voices, chatbots, and all of these kind of disembodied lifelike beings that are around us. And so I think widening our span of what we consider reality by widening our understanding of intelligence is maybe really where I want to get with that. And then the second question, could you ask that again?
Yeah, the second question, there's a few in that post, but maybe it boils down to why can't we just accept the AI's creation at face value?
Mm. Well, I think for one, when we're looking at the history of technological design, so much work has been put into us just taking a piece that was at face value. So that hand that you were talking about in your talk has been carefully designed away over decades of captology and tech persuasive design. And so taking AI or taking the outputs of a technical system just at face value is to like ignore the vast infrastructure of decisions, choices, and capitalist, extractive, surveillance intent that is beyond them. So I think it's very dangerous to take things that for products and generative systems at face value. I think there was another part of your question about like what can artists do, and I think linking to what Jennifer was speaking of. I think there's so many paradigms from what technology can be, and I think artists are really good at thinking about what is a non-extractive paradigm for technology, what's a non-surveillance paradigm for technology. Part of that could be like local ownership of models. I think there's Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst who have this choral work where they're training a model on choirs across the UK, and all of the choirs own the sonic models and the training that comes out of it. And so the question is like, can that local ownership of models scale? And I think a lot of these big issues that we're running to are, the fast and break things, like the explosion of scale of these technologies. And so just build them from the ground up according to other paradigms and imperatives might be one way.
Was that my two? I may have been my two. I tried to link some, but that in general they all come down to assessment.
Yes.
How do we assess value in these, whether they're AI or human or if they're just pulling data sets. So
Yeah.
I think that those answers address many of those questions and comments.
I appreciate the critique of the first question.
Yeah.
Always revise and improve.
I don't know if they're still in the room, but I thought it was nice also. Okay, I'll turn it over to Susie.
All right, I have a couple questions for Vanessa. The first one is, what happens to the body physiologically when it is subjected to systems and outputs that are not human-centric by design, i.e. designed for machines to complete tasks and don't serve human needs? And a follow-up question to that is, what are the long-term effects for humans potentially when modifying themselves to accommodate machines?
So, very big question. Okay. So the first question: what happens to the human body when it's subjected to machinic kind of process that haven't been designed for them? And I think we go through that all this time. People work in factories; they're kind of transformed into machines. Like there's a long history of the imposition of machinic kind of operations onto people. Whether it's making a car in the Ford factory or working in the Amazon warehouse, if people are kind of detached from human scale and human experience and human time, then I think they kind of lose a sense of kind of their own fundamental value and worth. People break down. People are not machines, then they need rest, they need inspiration, they need connection with each other. And if they're kind of being interpolated into systems that don't recognize and honor that, then I think, they lose a sense of, or we lose a sense of why we're even kind of integrating these machines into our lives. Is it to generate more capital? Is it to just make more stuff? So I think that's kind of a key element there. I also think, to kind of reflect what Nora's saying, it is important to decenter human perspectives as well. Maybe not everything should be designed for people, but perhaps that's not just integrating, machinic perspectives or machine processes into how we live and we work. It's about, animal kind of intelligences and that kind of thing. Because we do live in kind of an ecological world, and everything we do and everything we experience is intimately entangled with other beings, other kind of forms of life. So that's kind of like a both and question. There's a kind of loss of what there is, that is important about being human, but also it isn't that important to maintain everything that is human, I think. Second question was, can you repeat that, please?
What are the long-term effects for humans, potentially, when modifying themselves to accommodate machines?
Right. It's a related question. What are the long-term effects when people are modifying themselves to accommodate machines? I think it kind of depends on how people are modifying themselves to live with machines. You know, there's a really interesting art project. There's an artist, I can't have his name right now, but he's got this project called the iBorg project, and he's colorblind, and so he's developed a prosthesis whereby it takes he wears it and looks like a third eye, and he wears it and it takes color input and translates it kind of into sound input. It's kind of like a forced synesthesia, and he lives long term with this machine that's very thoughtfully designed to create a new dimension of experience for him. And for that particular person, it's expensive. It kind of creates new dimensions of experience that maybe weren't available before. But that's a highly individual, personalized machine that is designed for that purpose. You know, and I think if you look at the history of disability, there's a lot of user-centered and user-initiated design as well, where people develop tools and machines to help them and create, you know, accessible lives for them. And that's great. You know, a wheelchair is a kind of machine, and wheelchair users means they can get around. That is a wonderful and great thing. But if you're talking about a ring system that is everywhere, and people are kind of modifying their behavior and their, you know, walking differently or moving differently or not being able to kind of go places because of surveillance systems. One of the stories I talk about in my book is this lawyer who was barred from going into Madison Square Garden. Yeah. You're familiar with that?
Oh, yeah.
Because she's part of a legal team that was prosecuting the company, I think, right?
And my boss is a Knicks fan, and he refused to work on that case because he really wants to be able to go.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm not on this case. Leave me off.
But this is like a major long-term impact of living with machines. When you allow machine vision into your lives, it literally polices your embodiment. Can't go watch that Knicks game, can't get on that airplane. You know, there's a real literally policing of where your body can go. That, you know, that limits your experience in very kind of critical ways. So I think my answer is really about like what a particular tool or technology embodies, what kind of intention it embodies, who it's serving. Is it integrated into kind of corporate surveillance systems? Is it designed to create access? Who is it designed with and for? Is the person whose body is using it part of the design process? You know, then can kind of be in service of growth and expansion and greater experience, or enclosing that kind of experience.
Thank you. That was actually from one person, so I wonder if I have another question.
Okay.
I'm going to paraphrase this one. Yes, to Jacquard Loom de-skilled workers, the power to design the punch card remains centralized out of reach. That's not what's happening now. Things are being democratized. Technology is becoming more and more accessible to the everyday person. What does that have in terms of potentially long-term effects that you might predict?
I mean, I think the rhetoric of democratization often accompanies new technologies. You know, even like, and that's great. The printing press meant more people could read, but it was also a double-edged sword because not everything you read is great, right? Sometimes it's, you know, and the internet was also a kind of democratizing platform, particularly Web 2.0, the Wild West of the internet, which is when I joined, and it's not that anymore. So there are always ways, I think, that technologies are democratizing, but what are they granting us access into exactly? You know, when there are, you know, initiatives to bring laptops and computers into schools, but okay, maybe it's a Chromebook, so then you got to use Google Chrome, and if you use Google Chrome, you got to use the entire Google suite, and if you're using the entire Google suite, you have to give them X, Y, and Z information. There are trade-offs, I think, with all of these kinds of moments of technological uptake, and yes, there are these impulses to kind of democratize, but I think I always ask, we kind of, do technology. I don't think they need to be demonized, but do they expand or contract our horizons, and who are they serving? And are there guardrails to kind of determine, like, okay, maybe this is kind of morphing to a point where it's not serving us anymore. It's the veneer of democracy. But what are we voting for exactly? Like, who are we choosing between?
Thank you. Experience. Oh, Nora?
Can I respond?
Yes.
Yeah, and something that you brought up as we're speaking about this, and this question of democratization, I think about we just finished looking at the Whole Earth catalog in a criticism of AI talks that I read, where Stuart Brand's motto of the Whole Earth catalog was access to tools, and so a lot of the rhetoric and speech about new technologies was really tied up this beautiful vision, which was very seductive. When if you experience before internet and then the internet, the idea is like Wild West, this frontier, this access to information, you would gain that utopias, new societies that could be built. But I think there's also then this depoliticization that often happens, which happened with Brand and happened with a lot of the communes around the Bay that then became the foundations of Silicon Valley, which was this idea of the restart, which you have embedded into software as well. And so that rhetoric of newness and innovation, and each new tool opens and directs towards some glittering far off future is it's very seductive because we want big solutions to complex social problems. The idea that there is a technical solution to a complex social problem is, when the social seems to be failing, it seems like a solution, but often it's not.
Yeah, and I think a lot of current technologies too, there's this a linguistic and conceptual heist that happens where you think you're getting democracy, or you think you're getting friends, or you think you're getting connection, because those are the words that are kind of being preferred to you. You're my friend on Facebook, so you must be my friend. But, are you friends? What is the nature of that connection? So I think it bears kind of examination and constant examination, whether these increasingly accessible technologies are doing what they promise to do.
Okay, we already transitioned a little into paneling there, which was fine, but okay. So I have a few questions, and we're gonna work through a few general topics that I thought were showing up in a number of the talks, and I was gonna end with this one, but I'm actually going to start with it. So I think every one of you mentioned inevitability sometime during your talk, or that terminology, as well as use of imagining different ways that the landscape of AI could be. I'm going to use AI generally. I mean LLMs, ML, all the things that fall under that umbrella. So when I use AI, don't pigeonhole. Okay, so a lot of contemporary AI discourse treats current trajectories as inevitable, and kind of collapses the range of other possibilities. What do you think imagination? Where do you think imagination is narrowing too quickly, and around labor, authorship, governance, culture, and then what alternative futures should we be actively rehearsing now, both institutionally, culturally, rather than accepting by default? And some question of that would be, what, and you were just touching on this, what role do language, art, design, speculative practices play in that unfolding future? Anybody want to go first?
I did start. Just because I thoughts on my mind. I just as you were speaking and asking the question, I was thinking of Ursula K. Le Guin's carrier-back theory of fiction, which I'm sure folks have like come across it, but it is a very short, beautiful 6-page essay where this amazing speculative and science fiction writer, Gwynn, writes about the teleological narrative of inevitability that is so built into technology, and then posits the carrier bag theory as this alternative story that resists the story of like the hero, the master, imperial conqueror of space and land, whatever else. And so I think a lot about the ways that like predictive logics shape our sense of creativity, like by like foreclosing territories that one can go into, and by having alternative paradigms like the carrier bag theory, where you collect, where you assemble, where you examine the ideas that are going into your theoretical toolkit, is one kind of strategy that I see a lot of young artists using, and young programmers and designers as well. So I'll just start with that, and let you guys go.
Yeah, picking up on this notion of like this teleology, I mean, it's very difficult to separate the ideology of much technology from this capitalist narrative of progress. And I think that they're not fundamentally married, and that we can have an alternative vision of technology and what technology and the place that technology is in our lives. You know, and it may be that we draw that from other communities. So some projects that I think might be instructive for thinking about how to mitigate that or to evaluate what our technologies and AI are doing are, just to name a few. In my day job, one of the projects I run centers on disabled media artists. And we just wrapped up a lab centered on AI. And the lead artist spent a lot of time trying to work with locally based kind of servers and local AI kind of tools. And this was interesting because it started to allow the participating artists to do interesting things. So one of the artists who is participating there, recent cancer survivor who's kind of still in treatment. And he was really interested in putting his scans through an LLM, but didn't want to share that information with OpenAI or Anthropic. So having these locally situated AI tools allowed him to do that and start kind of really thinking through what it was seeing and doing as a kind of like political system, right? How it was kind of parsing and looking at his scans. And he did this really interesting project kind of aligning that computer vision that looks at a tumor with the same kind of computer vision in drones, right? That looks for, that serves a military function. So that was, they eventually kind of culminated in this virtual exhibition called Slow AI, which was about, you know, on one hand, like being kind of against this, you know, speed of disruption, and the other, this notion of crip time, this idea that, you know, if you're disabled, you might need a more flexible kind of time, right? Because your body might not be up to something at any particular point. So that's one example that I think is really helpful, maybe for thinking about how technology should reflect community values and AI should reflect community values. Another example I think was really interesting that I learned about recently, Karen Howe wrote about. She wrote Atlas, no, Empire of AI. And she wrote about it a few years ago for, I think, the MIT magazine. And it was about a project in New Zealand for Maori language preservation. And people love talking about language preservation, right, when it comes to AI. But, you know, it's really problematic because you've got all this data. What are you going to do with it? Who's it for? It doesn't really kind of reflect the values. But the process of it was really, I think, compelling insofar as the people working on the project were also working locally. They went and spoke to a number of people in the local kind of Maori community, and they got buy-in. You know, they were really invested in the project. And then it took apparently just a few days to get all the data that they needed. Karen Howe called it pure, beautiful data. You mentioned garbage in, garbage out. No garbage. It wasn't the entire internet. It wasn't Reddit. It was the people creating a data set that was in service of the community, and that had community governance as well. So that's what I think can kind of start to model, right? Like where AI needs to go and be.
Yeah, I mean, LLMs are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. It may be possible, to run certain ones on the device or to have specific ones for specific purposes. But if you haven't used an LLM, I recommend that you do so. It's amazing, and this is what people want. And what people want is a big determiner of what kind of technology we get. Location tracking, same thing. We don't pay for what we get on the internet because we are eyeballs that get ads. As long as we have the ad-based model, they're going to track our location. Can we tweak the technology there where like location is stored on your device instead of a giant Google database? Yes. Are we going to get rid of location tracking? No. I mean, it is driven by people's desires, by like capitalist exploitation, by people's norms and expectations about what it means to live in a real world, and what they want. So we see things in the trajectory we do for a million reasons, and they're not specifically about the technology. They're really about the social and economic and normative world in which the technology grows. So if people are thinking like we're going to do a thing and then we're not going to have these extractive LLMs that we don't like, that's not going to happen. Spend your time elsewhere.
I know that Morrison is coming in a month, right, for the second part of the symposium. So when I think of artists like Morrison Naliari, Nora Al-Badri, Arati Akpedi, there are a lot of artists who are looking at the kind of like externalized storehouse of all of your photos as a place where you offload your memory. And we also have you've hundreds and thousands of photos that constitute your like artificial memories that you don't have like a direct, maybe perfect recall of in your mind. So we're like offloading all of these like this like massive archival like stories that we're carrying around. And so some of these artists, talking about not garbage in, not garbage out, like they're putting in their personal memories, family photos, family archives, and to address the kind of gap that comes with like diasporic exile. Arati has this beautiful project where she's trained all of her family's trained a model on all of her family's photos to find people that she had lost touch with, patterns in design, patterns in how like different generations of her family like related to each other that she doesn't actually have the stories for, which is a common experience for first and second gen folks. And so this idea of like using models in these poetic ways to address the kind of lacuna and the gaps that we experience and the social, I find very good thing. So
building on that a little bit, particularly your answer. So AI often exerts power through not through dramatic breakthroughs, but instead this kind of creeping into our lives and becoming so entwined that it's kind of a quiet normalization, if you will. So, we heard examples tonight of like default settings, automated decisions, invisible scoring systems, all sorts of things that are woven through, until we don't question it any longer. So from your perspectives, where's this normalization most worrisome right at the moment? Like, is it education? Is it surveillance? Is it education, labor, media? and why do these incremental shifts often escape scrutiny until they're so deeply embedded that we can't do anything about them? And how might institutions intervene earlier, what's an early detection system look like?
I mean, for me, and I think this comes as no surprise, and given what I spent my life doing, I think that the danger is from the government, and I think it is from surveillance and interference with our ability to express ourselves and to bring our power to bear politically. And I think the reason why it's been that way is, like I said earlier today, in some ways, machine learning in the system is effective. But I also think it has served the purpose of the penal system, which is to identify people who are undesirable for whatever reason, and then find like a cheap and easy solution for how we're going to deal with those people. So that's my fear. That's obviously where I've spent my time. But if you told me that, the real problem was through, the environment or something like that, I'd be like, yeah, that's probably true too.
I think when my second book was on Predpol, when it moved from LA to Detroit and started through this project called Project Greenlight, and I was writing about the way that the sudden appearance of these surveillance cameras outside of businesses, which were ostensibly but not immediately tied to machine learning models. That was the kind of rhetoric around it. But it was more about how it made people feel and rearrange their action the minute they enter the kind of zone of sight for the cameras. So when I think about Predpol or predictive logics as they feed into hiring systems and loans, I think about how we might also internalize that logic, and we get frozen by predictive logic to one moment or instant of time when the nuance and beauty of life is the capacity to change a zillion times. I changed my mind 20 times today, I'm sure. And that you should not be frozen by your algorithmic signature that was pulled in one moment in time, that was pulled from one moment in your life, even if you changed your context and ability in ways in the world so many times in ways that haven't been tracked. So I think of that as a kind of psychic enclosure, and even if it's invisible, you start to feel the effects of it over time. So I think we've talked about a lot of things to worry about, but that's what I worry the most about, for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one is the most worrisome. There's a lot that's worrisome. If you asked me last week, Grok, and the way in which it kind of gives expression to the worst impulses of people. I think you can say that about most technology, but probably what I worry about most now, particularly as a parent, is how the pace and the ease of these technologies can kind of preempt the development of creativity and thinking. I feel so much contemporary use of AI is just accelerating techno-solutionism, right? We want a frictionless world, and friction is important for people growing up. Things need to be hard. That's how you learn how to think. That's how you learn how to make interesting things. And, I don't think it's just that if AI exists, it's that, suddenly this tool exists in this pressure cooker environment where people have to deliver so much, right? Maybe it's delivering papers to get grades, or, all kinds of outputs that are the way in which people are determined to be valuable to society. Suddenly it's a nice hack there. So it's a perfect storm, and I think I don't know how the space is going to be there. Given the historical lens, I think that I've taken to everything, I'm optimistic that by the time my 4-year-old is, in the space where he's trying to do that kind of critical reading writing, it won't be as flashy. We'll have figured out some of this stuff. But I think it's extremely hard to be a teenager right now and a college student, because the weight of expectation to accomplish is so heavy, and yet jobs are increasingly being extinguished. And so how are you supposed to kind of place these technologies into your life in a way that, means you're not just meeting benchmarks, but you're becoming a more interesting, thoughtful human being?
Yeah. So, even labor-wise, pretty soon machines are going to be able to do all the easy stuff, but machines won't be able to do what true experts do. But how do you get to be a true expert if a machine is doing all the easy stuff? And we haven't solved that problem yet.
Yeah. Handwork, making, that kind of thing is really, this institution loves those. And we also thrive on critique. And so I had a question about critique. And, traditional critique assumes human intention, situated context, accountability, all sorts of, while algorithmically generated or co-generated works complicate all that. and intention becomes diffuse, context may be opaque, responsibility is distributed between not just the human, but also like a long history of the material that was ingested into the system. So, what do we think critique should target these days? The output, the system, the prompt, the data set, the institutional conditions that made the work possible, and what gets lost when critique can't locate agency precisely, if you will. And just one last tag on, how might critique shift then from interpretation towards, forensic analysis, ethical questioning, infrastructural awareness. What's in and what's out?
I mean, I'm curious about this too because I don't really understand the concept of it being like a machine thing that you can't criticize. These outputs do not exist in a vacuum. They're created by a person's prompt, and then one or the other of them is adopted by the person, and then maybe the person changes it or doesn't change it. It's kind of, I think of it kind of like you take pictures, and you can have, a whole series of photos on, like in the olden days, on like a contact sheet, but it's the artist who says, this is the one I took that I really like, and then that one gets blown up, and that one's in the museum. So I think that, and maybe this is because I'm a lawyer and I have a lot of opinions about most things, but I don't feel like I'm constrained in expressing my opinion or my criticism just because a machine was involved in creating it, especially because somebody's in the beginning of it and somebody is at the end of it. So I'm super curious what you're going to say.
No, I agree completely. I mean, I think so I trained as like a literary critic and a film critic, cultural critic, and that was a very like specific way of, and as you were pointing out, of viewer, object, specific historical lineage. It was, you could triangulate whatever you were looking at with this like other wider context and like the statements of other people. And I mean, when I started to write about technology 14, 15 years ago, I had to unlearn and undo a lot of how I understood what criticism should do, in part because the subject was always changing, it was always moving. And so now I think of criticism as like forming an argument and you take a position. But in writing about technology, I've had to evolve it continually. And so it becomes hybrid. The range is much bigger. To answer your question, you look at all of it, the output, the training, the choices, the artist, their relationship to the museum. Is the museum funded by XYZ tech company? It's like the entire structural kind of ecology for ecosystem. And so I think of not just one critic's voice, but instead criticism of technology needs to be collective, needs to be done with other people, needs to be like rowdy and constantly changing. It's also hybrid and evolving itself. It has to move with this subject rather than trying to pin it down and freeze it. So I've had to that's my personal journey. And as a critic, I've changed how I think of criticism and what its role is, which is to mirror back and help other people enter a space where they can access what is elite or blocked off or is seen as not accessible because you're not an AI engineer. You don't have a right to talk about the outputs and impacts of machine learning, even though it is these decisions are changing the material outcome of your life. So you have every right to talk about it and debate. Yeah. Yo.
When you ask me that question, I can't help but think about where teaching happens along all of these points in the trajectory that you've mentioned. I haven't been teaching in a college classroom for a while, and certainly not since, ChatGPT and Claude really kind of hit the market. But I have talked to a lot of friends and colleagues who have really struggled with how to teach and what to do. Sometimes I think there's a wholesale rejection, okay, well, we're going to use paper and pen in the classroom, and which means book that I buy. But then there's people who are also asking people to think at the level of the prompt and who start integrating the prompt into the teaching. And then that's where I think that critique comes in, and this kind of connects as well with how you're talking and thinking infrastructurally about the way in which these pieces are put together. Right. artists make choices. Artists and also writers, though, are always in collaboration with people. Books are, they have your name on it, like the person's name on it, but there were editorial comments. Sometimes an editor may have said something, that's a great phrase, it's going in. Their name's not on the front of my book. My name's on the front of my book. So, I think thinking infrastructurally and thinking collectively about how we put all of our work together and how it comes out anyway is just an important part of thinking about how we live together, right? And the way in which all of the pieces, all the people, whether it's people at the global south labeling the data to, the engineers kind of doing that work, all have some kind of impact on the work, right? And maybe as you teach that, and then later as you critique that, there is an ongoing reflection about how you're kind of bringing those pieces into play.
One last question from me. We're going to do the surprise thing of you all get to address one question to one of the other panelists. So the last question from me, is there's a lot of people saying that AI is a threat to creative work, but they often, in that phrasing, there's a lot packed into that phrasing of, for some, it's an economic fear, loss of jobs. For others, it's, cultural, the erosion of authorship, legitimacy, that kind of thing. We were just talking about that. The meaning of creative labor, psychological, loss of identity. And so I'm kind of curious when, I know tonight has been all about unpacking all of those terms, but I'm curious if you have comments about which of those threats is doing the most work when people say, creativity is under attack, and which ones need to be, which ones do we need to get more distance from, and how can we get the general public or people, even creatives, to think about that a little bit differently?
I can think about it in terms of value and how creativity is assigned value in the world that we live in. Anthropic tried to mitigate, I don't know whose idea this was, but tried to mitigate criticisms that, they did what Meta did, which is just illegally download a bunch of scanned PDFs of books. They went out and bought them and scanned them, then destroyed them. And so, we paid for it one time. And so because we paid for the creative work, we valued it. And so we can use it however we want. And it's not really plagiarism. And I think so much of this kind of discourse around creativity being under threat is how do we value creative labor? And, this is very much kind of generally talked about if people aren't doing that labor. The way people often talk about creativity when it comes to AI is kind of curation or creative vision or being a creative director. We don't get to be that person until you have that early job, maybe doing some design work or working in a design studio. Everything is kind of like entry-level jobs that let you start to articulate and get a sense of how those pieces fit together. So I think that fundamentally it's about value within a kind of creative economy that's a threat. I don't think creativity is going to go away. If it's a creative, we'll figure out how to do amazing things with creativity, with AI, but how are we going to live and work as creatives? That's I think, a real challenge.
I think there's such a long tail and long history in media art, computational art, software art of this romance that artists and creatives, like the language poets, Fluxus, Donna, there's so many movements where the romance of working with an automated system or to automate the creative process has been, paired, artists have drawn on that. They've found new material by externalizing the creative process in an automated system, trying their own ideas into an automated system. So it's every time there's a no, ban it, fearful kind of movement, I always think that's where you need to look closer rather than looking away.
I think there's an immense, were you done? I'm sorry. I was ready to go. I think there's an immense amount of gatekeeping by the people who are currently the hoarders of cultural power about not wanting other people to have access to it. And they place that fear or that like argument on technology when really I think what it's about is you don't want other people to be able to do things that you worked hard to do. You don't want it to be easier for them. You paid your student loans, so they should have to pay their student loans. And look at it throughout history, it's always the control of those in power. Who hated the printing press most? Churches. Why? They got to be the ones who said what was true. With the printing press, that was destroyed. Your example I love of the player piano, and maybe we're going to talk about copyright in that later, but the player piano, it's like people are like, oh, you won't be able to play the piano. People still play the piano, but what it did was it enabled people who couldn't afford that time, that luxury, or to bring somebody into their home to play. It enabled them to have that music in their lives. And, AI is like that, and especially the visual stuff, but, it helps people write their resumes and get better jobs. It has downsides, but, I have a friend and she made a tarot deck themed thing that was like ingredients and recipes, and they play with this really beautiful artifact, and it tells them, like, this is what we're going to get the ingredients, and then we're going to like make dinner from that. And it is gorgeous, and she would never have been able to create it in a million years because she's not an artist. But it gave her the tools to produce this thing that was like really satisfying and from her mind. And so I do think there's something important about learning to be an expert, but I also think there's something very important about people, and I will use the word, democratizing the ability to do certain things so that more people have access to it when otherwise they wouldn't. So I really resist this idea that it's like interfering with authorship or interfering with creativity as a general matter. I really think if you look at the history of technology over time, very often it's given people something that we need. So don't worry about that.
Okay, so yeah, we got started a little earlier, so I'm gonna go down. Now, transition to the phase where you each, and I warned them about this, I didn't just bring the, on this right now. You get to ask you each get to ask a question up to there.
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. My question is, how do you see, in terms of, the things that we talk about that structure our world, which is like law, norms, markets, and technology, like in terms of the things that we see in AI and, maybe technology more generally that are like problematic or that are like, things we might not want, like where is the pressure point for addressing those concerns? Is it in conversation and art and kind of involving norms, or is there a place for the market or for law to kind of intervene and have an effect?
Billy, okay, that was really question. I didn't get.
I read over your shoulder and I was like, I'm gonna help this guy out. No, I didn't. I made that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that every element of human activity must play a part in the world that's unfolding. I've been involved in the past few years with these initiatives coming out of the EU that are working at the seam of art, technology, and policy. And this idea that, there's a lot of tech policy that needs to be kind of thought through, but artists working with advanced technologies can kind of get new ways of, kind of foster new ways of thinking about that. So yeah, absolutely, use every lever in the toolbox, and get, I think more than that, people need to be in the same room so they're not in the same kind of disciplinary, I don't want to say echo chamber necessarily, but in the same disciplinary silo so that they can start to kind of see different perspectives. Not all artists are going to have the same attitude towards AI, but if you have artists in the same room as policymakers, as people working as economists, then we're all humans, and I think we can have a shared vocabulary about what counts and what's worth preserving. And yeah, it's a chicken.
Stand the line. Okay.
I think it's always like that. Actually,
Thank you.
I also think that the role of the artists in the age of AI has changed so dramatically. Like they're also, if they're working with AI, they're an engineer, they're a researcher, they're drawing on all of this like long history of artistic research where collaboration is essential. When I think one of like my favorite artist collectives, which is like this Hydra 90 to 100 person artist collective, Forensic Architecture, which uses machine learning and modeling, working with human rights researchers to fill in like gaps in court cases or like a sound that was missed or like a specific piece of data. They train models who work with these like large networks. So the artist becomes like one investigator within like a large group of investigators who has like a different, maybe like unorthodox way of doing it, constructing evidence or finding synthetic evidence in court cases. So I think, as the world has changed, it becomes more multiplicists. Well, I need a good for like the legal field.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I ask?
Well, you have the microphone, you can ask.
Yeah, no, I had a question. I wasn't sure who to direct it to. I mean, you both talked about the ways that we are trained by systems. I had a question about the hidden hand, but I don't know. Maybe I'll ask you over dinner. I mean, this is for Jennifer. I was thinking during your talk, and you were talking about ShotSpotter.
Yeah.
And the moment that the automated system can be like kind of corrected or rebalanced by having human intervention, interpretation. I'm curious, as we are trained by systems, even when we have that moment of human intervention, how does that person or how would that individual counteract the pre-training by seeing the automated decision? How do you counter that bias? How do you counter the kind of faith we collectively put in the correctness of the automated, even if their intervention is like a key rebalance?
Yeah, I mean, that's just such a good question because with ShotSpotter, once there's an alert, they send it to a human who has like 3 seconds or 10 seconds or something to say whether they also think it's a gunshot. Mm-hmm. But of course, the machine already told them that it was a gunshot. And same thing I mentioned with face recognition, they tell you it's just like a prediction, but they say, well, police just think it's a match. Mm-hmm. And they don't necessarily investigate it further. So it's just like, I think, a cognitive bias, and also people don't necessarily have enough time or something like that. And I'm not sure, with those technologies, there's no downside to getting it wrong, and showing up. And I think that, to me, I think it has to be more than just like relying on the human as the intervener. Somebody has to pay when someone screws it up, because unless like these companies pay when they're or the police department pays when it arrests somebody, the wrong person, and keeps them in jail for a week, even though they were never in the state, then we're not going to see any change. We have to make not just the person, but the system has to be motivated, like economically, to do a better job. I think that's really important. But we have the opposite now because of qualified immunity and all of these doctrines that insulate law enforcement from external accountability.
Makes question.
I have a question, but before that, I have a quick comment, which is systems like ShotSpotter really bother me because, I deleted, I never had Nextdoor. What was the other app? It's like Citizen. Because ShotSpotter makes you think that guns are inevitable, right? That you just have to find I grew up without guns. I grew up guns were legal, and there'll be no market for ShotSpotter where I am. And instead it's like, oh, there's a shot. Or maybe it's a firework, but probably a shot. So let's go investigate it and do something about it. And then nothing gets done about the fact that there are guns everywhere. So, my 2 cents there. But my question for you, Jennifer, is there an ethical place for machine learning in the police and legal system? And what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be used to identify bias, certainly, because you could do a mass thing and be like, these 100,000 people had the same kind of basic facts as these 100,000 people in their crimes, and here, they were sentenced differently, and it could be biased or different, jurisdictions or whatever. I think you could find a lot out, that way. I think certainly epidemiological things have a role in the criminal justice system. Why do people do bad things? Is it like, it makes a difference. Is it drug addiction or poverty or, lack of education? There's ways we can do some epidemiological research on why we have the basically largest number of people in prison of like all of the, Western countries and a number of other ones as well. There are things I have to say, and I don't know that all my civil libertarian friends are going to necessarily agree with this, but I think that there are things that we have in the criminal system that I think we could manage effectively, but we need to have some kind of safeguards in place so that we know that the information isn't being abused. And that, to me, is one aspect of it is we don't need this technique because it creates this data and the data will be abused and we can't stop that, so we shouldn't do it. That's true. But we also have areas where we have data, or maybe the data is good for some other purpose, so it's going to be there, so then we need rules. And rules are great, but as you may look around and see, the government doesn't necessarily follow those, so then there need to be penalties. But I don't want to be a total Luddite about, and I'm not a total Luddite, but that's how I sort of think through it. Do you guys relate to that question? No. I'm not following you.
And that was your question?
That was my question.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the panel session is done for the night. Thank you for sticking it out.